Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, and welcome to another webinar in our installment of the Science of Reading webinars. I am Yevgen Borodin, the CEO of CAPTI, and I'll be your host and facilitator. We hope that today's webinar will help you learn about a few new facts about reading fluency, and you'll walk away with a few new tools for developing fluency. All right, and finally, let's introduce our speakers today. It's Dr. Margaret Alpatz, who is a reading research scientist here in CAPTI, but she was a former elementary and middle school teacher and interventionist, so she knows a lot about what it's like to be a teacher and has a lot of theoretical knowledge about it as well. And Sean Morrissey was a fifth grade teacher at a well-performing school here in New York. And I know that his students are reading at high school level. So today he'll tell us how he made it happen. All right, without any further ado, Margaret, Sean, take it away.
All right, thanks, Yevgen. All right, hello, everybody. We're excited to talk about fluency today. So the way our webinar is going to work today is we will start off with a brief overview of the science of reading, and then we're going to go into differentiating between oral reading fluency and silent reading fluency. We'll go through some instructional practices and then move on to talking about how we can really motivate students to increase their fluency. And then we'll go into some instructional practices and talking about how we can measure silent reading fluency. So let's start off here. So we have this reading rope, and this is kind of prevalent throughout the science of reading discussion. And I think it's an important concept to discuss because within the education field, we understand that literacy is much more than just being able to sound out the letters on the page. We recognize that skilled readers really need to be able to master both what the words are, but also what they mean. So to really do this successfully, readers have to bring together the skills of vocabulary, language structure, verbal reasoning, among others, to really be able to read fluently. And Scarborough's reading rope really helps with this visual representation of like bringing all of these skills together. And we're bringing all of these skills together and kind of like wrapping them around one another to be able to produce fluent reading. So in previous webinars, we've really focused on specific strands. And now we're saying, okay, so you've got all of these skills and now we have to execute them all together to really produce fluent reading. So that's where we're going to focus on for the rest of the webinar. So we're going to move into, first of all, what is reading fluency? So I want to differentiate between oral reading fluency and silent reading fluency, because I think we often just assume that fluency means oral reading. But there's a reason that we should go into the silent reading, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So when we think about oral reading fluency, there's really three parts to it. We have this measure of accuracy. Is the student reading the words correctly? We also have the rate or the reading speed. Like how many words is the student reading within 1 minute? Then we also have prosody. So that's being able to read aloud with proper intonation, phrasing, and expression. And when we think about fluency, it's really defined as this ability to read with speed, accuracy, and prosody. And when students are able to do that, it actually shows us that they're comprehending at higher levels. And fluency really does show us who is able to comprehend. I think you can probably think of a student who isn't reading fluently, and they might sound choppy or awkward, or even robotic at times. Those students are definitely struggling with fluency. So it's important for us to acknowledge that, but that's the baseline of what oral reading fluency is. So when we think about reading fluency, we want to have this reasonable accuracy. There's this idea that we should have at least 95% accuracy, meaning that students are getting 95 out of 100 words correct while they're reading. And that's really important because that if they don't know the words on the page, it's going to be really difficult to make sense of the text. They should also have this appropriate rate. And we're aiming for about the 50th percentile. And I'll go over a percentile table in just a minute to kind of give you more context about what that means. But we're aiming for this 50th percentile because fluency is one of these skills that you are increasing and then you kind of bottom out, or you kind of like flatten out, I should say, because it's not a skill that we want to keep reading faster, faster, faster. There's actually a point where reading faster isn't going to help us with our comprehension. So it kind of levels out over time. So when we think about rate, it should really sound like speech. And then when I talk about suitable prosody, this mirrors spoken language, and it really helps us to be able to convey meaning. So with fluency, and specifically with that phrasal fluency, being able to read the phrases on a page is really helpful to show comprehension. And that's another point that I want to make about prosody. It actually reflects comprehension skills, but prosody doesn't actually contribute to it. It's showing us that students are able to read what's on a page and know where those phrasal boundaries are to really make sense of the text. So I want to quickly show you this percentile table. And when I mentioned really reaching for that 50th percentile, this bottom part here is the oral reading rate. When you're thinking about that 50th percentile, that looks a little bit different by grade level, but we're moving across the grades here. And this table only goes up to 8th grade. This is oral reading rates from measures like the ORF, like Dibbles or Acadians. And we want to like support students in getting to that 50th percentile. That's kind of where we're seeing like that's proficient, and students don't necessarily need to go faster than that. However, it is really important to note that if students are reading below 100 words per minute, that actually impacts their reading comprehension like over time. So you can see by 3rd grade, they should be reading at 114 words per minute. And these are end of year. This is an end of year norm table. And it's really important to mention that 100 words per minute because it impacts comprehension, because if you're not reading at least 100 words per minute, it's reflecting that there's probably some type of need for the student to get more support with their decoding or automatic word recognition, because they're spending a lot of their cognitive capabilities decoding the words, and that will impact comprehension. I do want to mention that oral reading fluency, there are lots of benefits. What we know is that through oral reading, students can actually learn to self-monitor, and it can actually like help struggling or beginning readers monitor their own progress. There's also oral reading fluency helps with that reinforcement of letter sound correspondence. So they're making that connection between what the letters say and sounding that out, and then getting reinforcements as they continue to read the text. And then reading and listening comprehension, they help to, reading and listening comprehension facilitate this understanding, and they work together to really produce comprehension. So when we think about fluency and reading out loud, we're really building this bridge between word recognition and comprehension. So it's kind of like this tool to support beginning readers and early readers in really making sense of what's on the page, and learning to connect all of those moving pieces that combine to make a skilled reader. So there's a big shift, and so often we talk about 4th grade, but there is another big shift within 4th grade. So we know that there's this shift of we're learning to read, and then we shift to reading to learn. There's also this expected shift that 4th graders will just shift to silent reading. So the idea is that once students hit 4th grade, they're expected to just effectively transition to silent reading. So this would mean that they are supposed to read faster and have that same comprehension level without the support of oral reading. So this is a big shift for students. The expectation of silent reading is actually like, it's more ingrained in our society in general, because silent understanding rather than that oral reading is really a literacy benchmark in our knowledge-based society. So when we think about silent reading, it's very important because it's actually the primary mode of reading for proficient readers. So a proficient reader doesn't often use oral reading to make sense of a text, but it would be more so that they're silently reading. So I have this little visual here because I think it's important to recognize that there is this shift. So when we move into fourth grade and then we move beyond, there's this shift in the expectation that there won't be this vocalization of behaviors anymore. So we move from students reading aloud, and then we might support them by saying like, okay, we're not going to read it out loud anymore. I want you to whisper read it. And then they might start to do like a mumbling sort of reading. And then the sub-vocalization comes about where students might move their lips before getting into silent reading. So there's actually this continuum where I have it modeled as a staircase here, a sequence that really helps students move from vocalizing their reading to relying on their inner speech. And this is a really important process because when we look at that final step of silent reading, that's actually where proficient reading lives. So it's important to help students if they are relying on oral reading or reading aloud, that we help them get to this point where they can start to rely more so on their inner voice. So I found this interesting. So readers who voice words or read with that like lip movement, they're not proficient readers. So I think that's a really key characteristic of readers, is to see like if they're moving their lips or making, like low sounds or, like mumbling to themselves while they're reading, that's an indication that they're not a proficient reader. They actually need support in moving from that oral reading fluency into silent reading. So here is what research really tells us about fluency and how to go about supporting students. So it's important to support students with that oral guided reading while giving feedback. So it's important for students to receive feedback on what they're reading. And this is, it's important to note, with typical students. To do this, it's important to combine 3 strategies. So students should have modeling of what fluency looks like. They should take part in repeated reading, and then they should also have some progress monitoring. So that's both effective and it motivates students to increase their reading fluency. So it's also important to note that this prosody really develops from acquiring efficient word and text reading skills. So as students get more and more practice, you should be able to hear that their prosody is developing, where they sound like they're speaking while reading, and that they're putting the emphasis and intonation where it should be. Repeated reading is really important as well. So it's important to note that when students are repeatedly reading, this should actually be at a difficult level. So it should be at their frustrational level, where they may be making approximately 10 errors in 100 words. And this is important because that's what is effective for building fluency. If it's too easy, students are going to just breeze right through the text. But if we really want to support them in increasing their fluency, it's important to give them a more complex text that's actually a little bit frustrating for them, so that they can improve their reading capabilities. I shared this last point here because as far as silent reading goes, it's really important to give students a specific task while they're reading. So Swan and colleagues provided 6 methods for fostering engaged silent reading. So if we want to support students in increasing their silent reading fluency, we actually have to give them time to read silently, but it needs to be in a way that they have a specific purpose. They have a little bit of choice in what they're doing. It's relevant to what they're learning. And by using these 6 steps that they've provided, we can help students improve their silent reading fluency. What we're going to do next, Sean is going to share with us. Sean is a wonderful teacher. His students are really lucky to have him. So he is going to take us through his instructional practices that really work for him and for his students.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a 5th grade teacher. I teach outside of Buffalo, New York. I'm a suburb of Buffalo, New York. I think some of the strategies and practices that I'm going to go through as the slides progress here, we're talking about upper elementary grades, 3, 4, 5, and into middle school for sure. We kind of think about reading fluency a lot with younger students, and it seems, at least my experience, that as kids get a little bit older in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, that sort of the reading fluency in the classroom sometimes falls by the wayside, and it's a really it's a non-negotiable in my classroom. So reading fluency, repeated readings, and things like that, I like to do it on a daily, for sure, basis. So first of all, I want to talk about fluency passages. So there's different people have different preferences. In my 5th grade class, my personal preference for passages is between 150 and 400 words. As you go younger, the passages tend to be a little bit shorter than that. I like a little bit of substance in the passages, so that's why I prefer maybe passages a little bit longer on the longer side. So in my classroom, when we think about my issue as a teacher, probably I see online there's a lot of teachers, literary specialists that are viewing this, is time. So opportunity cost, it just, we don't have enough time in the day for everything that we want to teach. So passages that I like to provide for my students are primarily in the content that I'm teaching. So whether that be the content in science, social studies, or in the ELA content as well. So one of the other things that I'm gonna talk to you about too is how to try to use time really efficiency. So if we're working on reading fluency, can we embed academic vocabulary within some passages? Can we focus on certain words throughout as well? So, we're working on fluency, but we're also, reviewing and reading words that maybe you taught in context, and your kids are getting exposed to those during fluency passages. So when I speak about, I'm a big academic vocabulary teacher. I think it's something that we really need to look at grades 3 through 8, teaching kids more words that are throughout different subject areas. Words like function, feature, aspect, words like that will show up in many of the passages that I use. I prefer harder passages, so definitely at grade level or higher. So I have a range in my classroom. I have students that are reading below 5th grade level, and I have students that I have some students that are solidly at a high school level. I have a few of those. So how can I challenge all students, but really bring up those students that are struggling with their fluency? I found great success using a little bit harder passages for sure. So where do the passages come from? So some of my passages that I use throughout the day is just right from the curriculum. So the science and social curriculum that I'm using, or the ELA curriculum that I'm using as well. ReadWorks is pretty good. So sometimes I'll take passages right off ReadWorks. And lastly, I've started playing around with ChatGPT earlier this year with some pretty decent success. I don't use it for a lot of things, but ChatGPT creating fluency passages based on the content that you're teaching allows you to do a few extra things. So here's an example. So in reading, I use novel units through the Reading Reconsidered. Through Reading Reconsidered, Doug Lemov's model. So one of the 5th grade books that I use is Number the Stars, which is just an amazing book, takes place during World War II. So part of their curriculum is they embed lots of nonfiction passages that go along with it's a historical fiction book. So this is like one of the shorter nonfiction passages. So this is like a passage that I would typically use for fluency work with my students. And as you can see, like rationing's a word that I would probably talk about a little bit before we do the fluency work. A word at the end, difficult to procure during wartime. So within the fluency, I'll talk about words that kids may not have been exposed to, so we get pronunciation right. And then we'll probably spend a quick on the vocabulary beforehand as well. So this is a longer example from the same novel unit, Nazi Violence Against Jews. So I like to do some pronunciation beforehand because I don't want kids to be practicing incorrectly. They could be in partnerships, but maybe both partners don't know how to pronounce certain words correctly. So I like to write down probably, maybe from a longer passage, 5 or 6 words, make sure students pronounce those correctly. So I'll show the word, I'll pronounce it, I'll make them repeat it out loud as a group, kind of echoing me and how to pronounce the word. So we have less less miscues during the actual fluency work. So and this is a longer passage. So from the first passage to this one, those are kind of my passage lengths. Some are a little bit shorter and some are longer. So that's right from the curriculum. As we move on, so another thing too is we don't think about is like, this is part of the curriculum as well, like talking about a literacy term like foreshadowing. Why not do fluency work to really make kids learn what this aspect is about foreshadowing? Sure, I'll teach it, but why not have the kids read about it as well to do some fluency work? So I like to embed that during my school day as well. And so this is just a couple of ReadWorks articles that you can, you just set up an account in ReadWorks and you could use some of these as well. Passage lengths are for me, they're pretty good. They're kind of right in where I like passage length. And the last one, so here's just a really sample Chat GPT. So I like to embed vocabulary with fluency work. So these, the words in bold are 9 academic vocab words that I taught prior to this over the course of a few days. So, I try to embed them in, using Chat GPT. And this one was about U.S. senators. So it's giving kids some background on the U.S. Senate, especially like they serve for 6 terms, they talk about legislation, and then the kids are reading vocabulary words in context because they're getting those words multiple times. So it's building their fluency with those words, and it's building their understanding. So I try to, for like time efficiency, fluency work for me, it's not so separated from the content. I like using it as like kind of retrieval practice, like retrieving what we've learned in as we build our fluency. So those are where I get my passage. I try to be simple. I try not to overwhelm myself. So those are basically the three ways that I like to use. So there are some fluency approaches that we have. So I'm big in repeated reading. I love repeated reading. I generally, most of my time with fluency work is with partners and with repeated readings, repeating the same text, the same passage multiple times, 3 to 4 times. One way that I like to do it, very simple. I just like to partner students up after we talked about some of the hard to pronounce words, and they alternate paragraphs. So one partner reads the first paragraph, then the next partner will read the second paragraph. They alternate, the first time through. The second time through, they'll switch. The third time through, they'll switch again. So I like for them to repeatedly read like 3 to 4 times by alternating paragraphs. Other ways is echo reading of paragraphs as well. So I'll have a stronger reader read a paragraph, and then I'll have a weaker fluent reader reread the same paragraph at least the first time through that passage, to kind of provide a little scaffold, a little support for more of the weaker, fluent student. Choral reading, I do a little bit of it. I know some teachers love it. So it's just reading with the class at the same time. So it's another strategy that the research has a good support behind. And to kind of spice things up for fun, readers theaters are great. Like, I just kind of go out there, Google different readers theater. I try to Google readers theater that are in like the content that we're learning. So like if it's World War II, I like, kids to do some readers theater, on subjects of World War II. So basically readers theater, they have parts. It could be like 4 to 6 different parts in a short story. And they'll go home, practice their specific parts, and then perform in front of the class in their groups. So it's kind of a fun way, a motivating way to build fluency as well. So my partnerships is very simple. I'll just go through this pretty briefly. Prior to breaking into partnerships, I don't do this every time, but definitely sometimes if it's a harder passage, I'll read that passage out loud, modeling appropriate fluency. So even like little things as students, progress to 5th, 6th grade, if you're reading a nonfiction passage and it has subheadings, for some reason, like my 5th graders at the start of the year, they'll just skip right over the subheading, but the subheading's organizing everything. So it's a reading strategy for the kids. So I'm modeling fluency, but I'm also modeling some reading strategies like, oh, no, we stop at the subheading. This is giving you the organization of what's about to come. So I'll pronounce difficult words, have students repeat the correct pronunciation beforehand as well. And quickly reviewing and discussing vocabulary. So that's kind of how I set up right before we break into partnerships. So I like to keep things simple. I like my routines though. I'm a teacher who I hate losing time. Like every minute matters. And if our routines are not set well, we're just wasting time that we could be used for fluency work or vocabulary work. So at times I'll let students choose a partner. They know they have to choose a partner really quick. They have 10 seconds, choose a partner, go to a spot, and they begin. So that's the procedure. They know it well. They alternate paragraphs and read the paragraphs in the passages 3 to 4 times to build fluency. So those harder, more difficult content words, it's repeatedly reading those words. It's getting more into long-term memory. They're kind of encoding those words better. So error correction strategy, I like to keep it simple. Teaching the kids at the start of the year. Partnerships, if a student mispronounces a word, their partner just stop. This word is, and that their partner pronounces it correctly, and they make their partner go back to the start of the sentence to reread that sentence. So I like a little bit more on the simple side. Paragraph shrinking is a great strategy that you can use. So sometimes I'll have the kids do paragraph shrinking, sometimes not, depending on the length of the passage, depending on time in the classroom. So basically, paragraph shrinking is after a paragraph, the student will summarize with like short, like 10 words, the who or what of the paragraph, the most important things of the who or what, or maybe summarize the main idea. So paragraph shrinking, I think, is a great strategy that accompanies reading fluency, because then the kids are thinking a little bit more. It's about reading the words correctly, quickly, but the whole goal is for them understanding what they're reading. So we're going back to foreshadowing. So if you just take a quick look at this, and then we're going to talk about this passage right after, we can move on. So echo reading. So if we think about echo reading as we move, so I'll assign partnerships as well. So it's about half and half in my classroom. So I'll let kids pick their partners half the time, or I'll assign them. So this is the typical way, sort of in the research that and many teachers do. They assign like the strongest. Number one would be the most fluent student. So they assign it with like the student kind of in the middle of the class, because you try not to assign the most fluent student with the weakest fluent student. Sometimes those partnerships don't work out the best. So I try to just like kind of rank order my kids quickly, look at their personalities as well, and kind of mesh that with the partnerships that I'm combining. So so very simple. With partnerships, I kind of want to go over this again. It's very simple. The stronger fluent partner will read a paragraph, and then the student who struggles with fluency will reread that paragraph. So it's just giving them a little bit of a scaffold, giving them a little bit of support. Rereading the passage 3 to 4 times. That's kind of my goal. You want it definitely more than once, but there's also the time factor. You can't do fluency work, all day. So, I think 3 to 4 times is a good time period, at least from my experience. And then the paragraph shrinking can be used as well. So, like for example, in this passage, I think this is a good passage for paragraph shrinking. So when we talk about like Germany invading Poland, there was, food was scarce. Those are some of the things that the kids would talk about, and summarize what would happen in that paragraph. So they're using paragraph shrinking. It's on the topic that we're learning about, and they're building fluency. So trying to use time as efficient as possible, for sure.
We're going to talk about how we can actually motivate fluency. So I don't think it's any secret that readers who find reading laborious tend to not want to read. I think that we can all understand that you probably have experience with a student who's struggling to read fluently and, just like not necessarily wanting to. And I think like if you go through all day, especially as Sean's mentioning, we're really focused on like upper elementary to high school with our strategies today. And thinking about if you're struggling every day to like make sense of the text, it's like, why would you even want to try after a while? So we want to think about how we can really support students and motivate them to kind of get beyond the point where they're struggling so that they can start to be successful in their reading abilities. So let's just like think about how we can motivate students. So with oral reading fluency, there's a few things. One that Sean already mentioned is reader's theater, but you could also use other types of drama to really support students in delivering their lines in a play to really support their excitement to actually read. So this is very different from like the popcorn style reading that probably most of us experienced. It's different because we can actually support students in practicing their lines before they actually deliver them in front of somebody else. We can also conduct repeated readings, and it's really important, as Sean mentioned, to really give that error correction so that students get the feedback that they really need in order to improve their reading, their accuracy or their rate. And then we should also chart the growth. So I share this chart over here, and this comes from the University of Utah's Reading Clinic, which is where I spent most of my time as a doctoral student working with Dr. Kathleen Brown there. And we had students chart their growth so that they could actually like see that they're improving over time. So this charting of their fluency was imperative to their long-term success because they could see like even if they were reading grade levels behind, they could see that their fluent reading was increasing as they were able to read more and more words over time. So I think it's really important to really make that visual that you can like see that the success is happening. For silent reading fluency, it looks a little bit different, but we can really support students in moving along that continuum that I showed you of those vocalizations to to relying on their inner voice and showing them, like being explicit, like, okay, you are actually like showing us that you're improving. I'm not seeing you like whispering anymore, and really supporting students through that continuum to get to that silent reading, since that's where we know that students or that proficient reading lives. There is a tool here that I've included a link to. You will get these slides afterwards, but it's a silent reading assessment form. And that can really help just to give some observational information about how the student is progressing and what type of skills they need in order to continue to progress to become a proficient reader. And then the same thing can be done here. We can have students complete silent repeated readings where they read through a passage and mark where they ended. This one, I think, working with teachers, I often got the question of, well, how do we know if they actually read the passage? There you can do some quick comprehension questions, like, what does the author want us to know? Or what just happened? And it helps students to make that connection between I'm silently reading, but I'm just because I'm silently reading doesn't mean that I don't also have to attend to comprehension. So that's another helpful strategy. You could use the same type of chart where you're charting the growth. The only thing you won't know is the errors. It's really hard for us to know how accurate a student is, but if they've had that opportunity to read it a couple of times, hopefully they are improving their fluency. Okay, so now next, Sean is going to take us through some of his instructional practices that really help to motivate his students.
Okay, so talking about like here's just a sample of Reader's Theater. So the Betsy Ross story. So this is just there's just so many out there. But like there's other, like there's certainly ones that that are very much worth buying as well. But what I like to do is just have my kids practice. We'll practice some during the day. A lot of it at practice is actually at home, practicing their different parts and then just presenting as a class. So I think as we think about like grades, especially 3 through 5, I'm not sure, my personal experience, if we do enough fluency work. I think, we tend to do a lot of silent reading, but we really need to spend some time on fluency. So just motivating students with Reader's Theater. And what's interesting with motivation is what I found is we try to motivate, like Reader's Theater kids will like it a little bit better. They'll because there's a story that they'll be into it. But I have found that once students start to really improve their fluency, that's where the motivation begins. So like as a motivational aspect, getting better at something motivates you to do even better. Like me personally as a teacher, in the last couple of years, I think I'm feeling really good success building my kids' reading skills. So I'm motivated to even like read more research and do more things and get better myself. So a lot of the times the motivation, it's coming right from getting better. So, but Reader's Theater, it's a little bit of a motivating tool for kids for sure. So we go on to the next slide. So this is a couple of quick pictures, snapshots from my classroom. I very much love books. My classroom library is 10,000 books. I want kids to be reading as much as possible. There's only so much time in the school day. So, if you give kids 45 minutes of independent reading time, well, then you're not doing something else for 45 minutes. So there's give and take there. When we talk about book access, though, the students who are fluent readers have access to all of those books in my classroom. So they can access 10,000 books. If students come in and their fluency is weak, they're not very motivated because they know they have a hard time, they don't have access to all those books. So my goal is to implement things where they're going to get better as quick as possible, so they have access to as many of those books as possible. So that's kind of one way I like try to motivate them. And I know there's a lot of literacy specialists on here. So like thinking school-wide, like what is the school-wide plan for fluency? You know, does every teacher have a plan for fluency? Is fluency, or is fluency being like fluency activities being done throughout, you know, throughout the day? You know, how many times? I think you can go into a lot of upper elementary classrooms and especially middle school, and the kids are never orally reading out loud. There's no fluency practice. One of the things that I think for my students is motivating is, as a whole grade level, I'll actually show them the data based on the grade level. So we'll do individuals, but I'll sit down and put up as a class right now. The typical growth is like reading maybe 15 more words than at the start of the year. Our classroom growth now in the winter is like 30 some. So we are making double the progress for maybe like an oral reading fluency measure. And not making the kids like speed through those, because that's not helpful as well. So making sure when you're doing those type of assessments, you're just saying read like you normally do, because you don't want to invalidate those results. So personally, I make sure fluency it's a daily occurrence in my classroom. What I found is fluency growth, my typical fluency growth over the last couple of years is typically twice as much as typical norms. So the kids they're building their fluency about 2 grade levels, and their comprehension is the same. So I do a lot of vocabulary work as well, but typically now I'm getting like scores that on average kids are making about 1 year, 8 months to 2 years progress in a year. That's sort of typical growth in my classroom, but I think fluency plays a big part. It's a non-negotiable. We're going to do it every day.
Great, thanks, Sean. So now I'm going to take you through how we can measure silent reading fluency. So I'll take you through a little demo of the CAPTI platform so that you can see how we can use the CAPTI Assess with Read Basics to assess silent reading fluency. I'm going to walk you through here. So I'm just logging in. And once I get into CAPTI, I'm going to show you quickly. I will get to the reading fluency, but I'm going to first show you how to create an assignment. So I'm logged in as a teacher. I'm clicking on, oops, sorry about that. Let me see if I can pull this down a bit. Okay. All right. So I'm clicking on Read Basics because that's where I'm going to find the reading assessment. Let's say I want to say this is for fall and for 7th grade. What's unique about CAPTI Assess with Read Basics is that you can select, it measures these 5 foundational skills and reading comprehension. So you can actually select if you really only wanted to focus on fluency, which is here reading efficiency. It's a maze style assessment. You can actually just like click and say, okay, today, all I want to focus on with students is their reading efficiency. So I can click there and then you'll actually see that this suggests that it'll take about 9 minutes, which is a pretty quick assessment. I know from years of giving the maze or days, 9 minutes would be great for me to be able to do that. So then I would press create and the students could start taking the assessment. Then you can actually look at the reports once students complete the assessment. So I'll walk you through some of the reports. So here I'm going to go to classes and I'm going to look at a 7th grade class that I have created. So as far as the statistics that I'm going to be able to look at, I'm going to be able to see students' overall profiles. So based off of their 6 subtests, they'll get an overall profile. If students for the most part score at the lower part of the scale, they'll get a low profile. Medium is like mostly medium level performance, and then you can also have high or notable. Notable profiles came about. ETS looked at thousands of administrations, hundreds of thousands, I should say, of administrations, and found that there were specific types of profiles where students were scoring at extreme levels on certain tests. So let's say a student scored extremely high on word recognition and decoding, and then really low in reading comprehension. That was marked as a notable profile because it seems like there's some underlying concern that should be looked at in with greater detail. So that's the profile. Then you'll see the assessment status, whether or not students have completed it. You'll see it for each of the subtests down here. And then there's an absolute scale. So you'll see how students did on each of the subtests based on this absolute scale. Grade equivalency is here as well. There's the red is 2 or more grade levels below, orange is 1 grade level below, and then green is at or above. And then there's this customizable RTI tier recommendation section where you have students broken down into 3 tiers, and you will be able to see how students performed as a whole class. So that's kind of like the global picture, and then we can get deeper into specific students. So within this report, you'll have the score, grade equivalent, score, and then percentile. You can also see we have Lexile here. So each student has information for each of the subtests. I can change the view, and you can see this is the grade equivalent score for each of the subtests, and then you can also see percentile. I like this view because you can sort and you can see how students are doing. If I look at reading efficiency, now I can see who would need the most support, and then which students may not need additional support in building their silent reading fluency. When I click on a specific student, let's see, I'm going to click on this top one. Okay, so this is Chase's performance. You come into the specific student's report, and you'll see that Chase is medium, meaning that he's most likely scoring right around that low or high average on most of the tests. So I look here and I can see the individual subtest reports or scores, percentiles, and grade equivalent score. And then as I go down, I can see Lexile across the year. And then each individual subtest has a report that shows how the student did on the subtest, and it gives you a little bit of insight into here's what they can do, and then here's what they'll benefit from. There's more on what they'll benefit from that gives you a little bit more guidance, and I'll show you that in just a minute here. So there's also this part of the report that shows the report history. So you'll see where the student started and then how they've done across the year. So then the next part is the recommendations. You'll see here that there are recommendations for each of the sub-skills. What we did here is we culled the literature and we really created this scope and sequence for each of the subtests to say, okay, so here's the foundational skill. What would it take for students to get from this weak performance level to low performance? And then we continued on to high performance and then strong performance. So we've tried to make it clear what students will need to reach toward proficient reading. So that is what the actual platform looks like. Now I want to show you some of the specific item types that are used to assess reading efficiency. So when students are in CAPT Assess and they're taking Read Basics, this is what the reading efficiency looks like. So we're really, it's really concerned with the ability to silently read text accurately and at this appropriate rate for understanding. So as students are reading the passage, they are given 3 choices within one sentence. So it's that maze selection technique. And students click through. So they answer and then they click through to the next one. And what happens is it actually just continues building the passage screen by screen. And this is also timed. So students get 3 minutes, which is the same as, I know, Dibble's measure of days. And they'll keep going through to select the answers as they go, and then they'll reach a time limit of 3 minutes. So it's as much as they can answer within those 3 minutes. So that's what reading efficiency looks like within CAPTE Assess and Read Basics. As I mentioned, there are the 5 subtests for foundational reading skills, and then 1 more for basic reading comprehension. On average, the first 5 take 5 to 9 minutes, and then reading comprehension is a little bit longer, 20 to 30 minutes. There are at least 30 items for each of the subtests, and this really helps with validity and reliability. So the more items that we have, the more valid our results become, and we can really rely on those results to help us inform our instruction. So here I'm going to pass it back to Yevgen, and he'll take us through the next couple of slides.
Well, I'd like us to get to the Q&A because we do have a few questions. Let's go to the next slide.
All right.
And just to say that this CAPTE Assess integrates with a variety of tools and then we have professional development and free basic training, paid PD. Let's go to the next question. Okay, so if you want to have a free trial, ask Erica, our sales director, and let's get those questions. Brian, I think you were keeping some of the questions to be asked live, right?
Yes, I will read them out. So first one is from Courtney. Sean, it was about the strategies that you use to motivate students with fluency. Courtney asks, would these be effective with ELL students as well?
Certainly. So I have ELL students in my classroom, and those students are generally the least fluent. So I've had really good success with pretty much all students, for sure.
Okay, thank you. An anonymous attendee asked, how do you assess prosodic oral reading? So you guys were talking about that.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think this one, I don't have a specific tool in mind, but I do know that we, with a specific intervention that we're working on at CAPTE with the SERP Institute, they have a phrase. It's a phrased reading passage that supports students in reading at that phrasal level. Since we do know in the literature that there's often these problems with phrasing and reading because these phrasal boundaries are not apparent to students. So there are these phrased reading passages where there's just those slashes between the phrases. And then they're actually using a tool to assess prosody within that intervention. And it's more of an observational tool. So students are reading aloud, and then the teacher is marking level 1, 2, 3, or 4. And those levels are, they're differentiated based on if the student's reading primarily word by word, or if they're reading in 2-word phrases. And then level 4 is that they're reading in these large, meaningful phrases. And that, like, there might be sometimes where they're not reading in those phrases, but for the most part, they're pretty consistent in preserving the syntax within the sentences. And I can share a resource for that if you're interested.
Thank you. Okay, last one from Andrew. How do you suggest identifying students who struggle with silent reading fluency? So I know we've shown the assessment, but you can answer that.
Yeah, I think what I would suggest is using something like the CAPTE Assess with Read Basics, that reading efficiency measure. And as I mentioned, it is a maze construct. So if the school had something like that, they would be able to use maze as well. Sean, do you have anything that you want to add about that one?
So I think just in general, we talk about fluency is like, I know there's a lot of literacy specialists on is how much time is your school spending in each classroom, and then how are you evaluating it? So like for me, I use CAPTI because it's one way to evaluate whether, my instructional, what I'm doing, is it really working? So, I can't just like assume it's working. And sometimes teachers were not the best on identifying like, well, how well is it working? You want more of a standardized approach. So, those are the two things I look for. I definitely like both. I like oral reading fluency, but I like the silent reading fluency measure on CAPTI as well. Because sometimes, you don't pick up all kids with oral reading. Sometimes attention plays into it and things like that with the silent reading fluency. So that's why I like that subtest for sure.
Yes. Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending today.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Sean. If anybody has questions, we have everybody's emails in front of you. Feel free to drop them a question. And we hope to see you at our next webinar in 2 weeks. It will be, I think, also not just for elementary school, right? Decoding and word recognition in upper middle school and upper elementary and middle school, where decoding and word recognition are often ignored.
For sure.
Yes.
All right. Thank you all. Bye.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.